She changed the locks. I was standing on the porch of the house I'd lived in for 33 years, and my sister, who hadn't set foot on this farm in 20 years, had changed the locks. 6 days. That's how long it had been since we buried our parents. The dirt on their graves hadn't settled yet, and Brenda had already called a locksmith. She stood behind the screen door with a coffee mug that used to be Mom's and told me the house was hers now. The land, the money, all $28 million of it. She wanted me gone by morning. But here's what my sister didn't know, what none of us knew, until the lawyer opened the second envelope. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge. I'm Cecilia, 33, a farm accountant in rural Virginia. When my parents died, my sister showed up after 20 years and claimed everything: the house, the land, the money. She changed the locks while I was still packing. What happened when the lawyer finished reading the will is something I still can't believe my parents planned. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The Everett farm sat on 250 acres in western Virginia. Apple orchards, cattle pasture, a creek that ran through the back 40. 3 generations had worked that land. My grandfather cleared the first field with a mule and a borrowed plow. My father, Frank, expanded it, built the cold storage facility, signed the co-op contracts, turned a subsistence operation into something that employed 11 people during harvest season. My mother, Linda, kept the books until her arthritis got too bad, and then she taught me. I got my accounting degree at Virginia Tech, came home at 23, and never left. 10 years I'd been running the numbers. Every bushel of Fuji apples, every head of cattle, every equipment lease and insurance premium. I knew that farm the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every vein, every pressure point, every place where things could go wrong. My sister Brenda was 5 years older. She left the day she turned 18, threw her bags in the back of a boyfriend's truck and said, "I'm not wasting my life picking apples." She said it to our mother's face. Mom didn't cry. She just wiped her hands on her apron and went back inside. Brenda moved to Richmond, tried fashion school, dropped out, married a car salesman named Derek, divorced him, married someone else, divorced him too. Every Christmas she sent a card with a stock photo of a fireplace. Never visited, but she called. Always, when she needed money. 500 here, 2,000 there. My parents never said no. I asked my father once why he kept sending checks to someone who never came home. He said, "Because she's still my daughter, Cece, even when she acts like she isn't." It was a Tuesday in November. I was closing out the monthly expense reports when the phone rang. Not my cell, the landline in the kitchen, the one nobody used anymore except telemarketers and the county extension office. It was the state police. My parents had been driving home from the county farmers market. A deer jumped the road on Route 17. Dad swerved. The truck hit a guardrail and rolled down an embankment. Dad was gone before the ambulance arrived. Mom held on for 4 hours at Augusta Health. I sat beside her bed holding her hand. She never woke up. I called Brenda from the hospital parking lot at 2 a.m. Her phone rang 6 times. When she answered, the first thing she said was, "Is there life insurance?" Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are they okay?" Life insurance. I told her they were gone. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she asked about the house. I handled everything alone. The funeral home, the flowers, the obituary for the county paper. I called Pastor Greer at First Baptist to arrange the service. I called Tom Beckett, the family attorney, about the will. I notified the co-op, the feed supplier, the equipment rental company. I kept the farm running because the cattle didn't care that my parents were dead. They still needed to eat. Brenda said she'd come right away. She showed up 3 days later, and she brought Derek. Not the second ex-husband, the first one, the car salesman. They pulled up in a rental sedan and Derek got out first, squinting at the fields like he was appraising a used lot. I knew then that this wasn't going to be a reunion. It was an acquisition. Brenda stepped out of the car in a black designer coat and heels that sank into the gravel driveway. She looked at the house like she was inspecting a vacation rental. No hug, No tears. She walked straight to the front door, pushed it open, and stood in the foyer, turning in a slow circle. "This place hasn't changed," she said. "Still smells like hay and old wood." Derek was already wandering toward the barn, phone out, typing something. I watched him pace the property line, pausing every few steps to tap his screen. He stopped at the fence post where Dad had carved our initials when we were kids, BE and CE, and he didn't even see them. He was measuring. Brenda found me in the kitchen an hour later. She'd already opened the filing cabinet in Dad's office. "Where's the paperwork?" she said. "The deed. The bank statements. The will." I told her Tom Beckett had everything. The will would be read officially after probate began. Brenda leaned against the counter, Mom's counter, where Mom had rolled out biscuit dough every Saturday morning for 40 years, and said, "Tom Beckett is a small-town lawyer. I've already talked to a real attorney in Richmond." I asked her what a real attorney had told her. She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "That, as the eldest surviving child, I have primary claim to the estate. All of it." Derek appeared in the doorway. "How many acres again?" he asked. 250. He whistled through his teeth. I looked at my sister. She was already calculating. You could see it in her eyes. Not grief, not memory, not love. Math. The wrong kind. The funeral was on Saturday. First Baptist Church was standing room only. My parents had lived in that town for 40 years. Dad coached Little League for a decade. Mom ran the canned goods drive every Thanksgiving. People came from 3 counties. I stood at the pulpit and read the eulogy I'd written at the kitchen table at 4 a.m. I talked about Dad teaching me to drive the tractor when I was 12, how he made me back it up 20 times until I could do it without looking. I talked about Mom's system for the farm ledger, color-coded tabs, one for each month, everything in her slanted left-hand script. I kept it short. I kept it steady. Brenda sat in the front pew. She didn't speak. She didn't offer to read a passage or share a memory. Her phone buzzed twice during the service, and she didn't silence it. Derek sat next to her, arms crossed, looking at the ceiling. Pastor Greer gave the closing remarks. He talked about the Everett family's sacrifice and generosity, how they'd supported the church for decades. He looked at Brenda when he said it, not at me. That was the first time I noticed. After the service, people lined up to hug me. Ruth Ann Calloway, who'd been Mom's best friend for 30 years, held my hands and whispered, "Your mama told me everything's taken care of, sweetheart. Everything." I didn't know what she meant. I figured it was something people say at funerals, comfort words, like, "They're in a better place." But Ruth Ann squeezed my hands harder than comfort required. She looked me in the eyes like she was trying to tell me something she couldn't say out loud. The morning after the funeral, Brenda called me into the living room. She was sitting in Dad's recliner, the brown leather one with the worn armrests where he watched the Cavaliers every Saturday. Derek stood behind her with his arms crossed, like a bouncer at a nightclub. Brenda had a folder on her lap. She opened it and spread 3 printouts on the coffee table. Property records from the county assessor's office, a printout of Virginia inheritance statutes, a letter from the attorney in Richmond. "I've done my research," she said. "As the eldest child, I inherit everything. The house, the land, the bank accounts, everything Dad and Mom had." I looked at the printouts. The county records were public information. The statutes were pulled from a legal website. The letter from the Richmond attorney was a consultation summary, not a legal opinion, just a summary of what Brenda had told him. None of it mentioned a will. I asked her if she'd seen the actual will. She waved her hand. "I don't need to see it. I already know what it says." Then she leaned forward, and her voice dropped. "Let me be clear about something, Cecilia. You were never family. You were the hired help." The words landed like a slap. Not because they hurt, but because she believed them. 20 years away, and she'd convinced herself that the daughter who stayed, who worked, who held Mom's hand while she died, that daughter was the outsider. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "Then you won't mind waiting for Tom Beckett to read it officially." She said there was nothing to wait for. I walked out of the living room. By the time I reached the kitchen, I heard her on the phone with a locksmith. The next morning, I went to the front door and my key didn't turn. New lock. Brass. I could smell the metal. Freshly installed. I knocked. Brenda opened it, coffee in hand, wearing Mom's bathrobe. "Oh," she said. "You're still here? I thought you'd have figured it out by now." I told her I'd lived in that house for 33 years. She corrected me. "You lived in it. Past tense. It's mine now." She didn't yell. She didn't slam the door. She just stood there with Mom's mug and Mom's robe and a look on her face like I was a tenant who hadn't gotten the eviction notice. I went to my room through the back door, packed 2 suitcases, my clothes, my laptop, my accounting files, 10 years of farm records on a USB drive, and 3 binders of printed ledgers. I took the framed photo of Mom and Dad from my nightstand. Brenda watched me from the hallway. She didn't help. She didn't stop me either. I carried everything across the yard to the barn apartment, a converted space above the equipment shed that my parents had built for seasonal workers. 1 room, a kitchenette, a bathroom with a rust-stained sink. I set down my bags and stood in the doorway, looking back at the main house. The lights were on in every room. I could hear music, something loud and modern that had never been played in that house before. As I turned to go back inside the barn, I heard Brenda's voice through the open kitchen window. She was talking to Derek. "Call the realtor," she said. "I want this place listed by Friday." The barn apartment had a single window that faced the orchard. I cleaned the dust off the sill, set up my laptop on the workbench Dad had built, and made a list. Not an emotional list. A financial one. I was an accountant. When things fell apart, I made spreadsheets. I called Tom Beckett at 7 a.m. His secretary said he was expecting my call. Tom picked up on the first ring. "When is the official will reading?" I asked. He said, "Scheduled for next Tuesday. All parties must be present." There was something in his voice. Not warmth exactly. Tom wasn't a warm man. Precision. Every word measured. "All parties," he said again, like the phrase carried weight I wasn't supposed to miss. I asked if there was anything I should know before then. He paused. "Just be there, Cecilia. And bring your records." My records. 10 years of meticulous bookkeeping. Every contract, every invoice, every deposit and withdrawal. I'd kept them because that was my job. Now they might be something else entirely. I spent the rest of the day doing what I always did. Fed the cattle, checked the cold storage temperatures, updated the harvest projections for the co-op. The farm didn't stop because Brenda had declared herself queen of it. That night, I sat on the cot in the barn apartment and looked out the window. The main house was lit up. Music was playing. I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Brenda and Derek, celebrating something that didn't belong to them yet. Tuesday was 4 days away. 4 days of locks and declarations, and a sister who thought ownership meant possession. I'd worked this land for a decade. The books were in order. Everything was documented. I just had to wait. I was sitting in a barn on the land my family had worked for 3 generations, while my sister threw a party in the house I grew up in. She'd already called a realtor. She hadn't even read the will. If you've ever watched someone take credit for what you built, you know this feeling. Hit subscribe, because what the lawyer says next Tuesday changes everything. Brenda moved fast. Saturday morning she cornered the 2 seasonal workers who were still on the payroll, Luis and Tommy, both of whom had worked the harvest for 7 years, and told them their contracts were terminated. Effective immediately. Luis came to the barn apartment with his hat in his hands. "Miss Cecilia, she says we're done. She says the farm's being sold." I told him nothing was being sold. Not yet. I couldn't promise him anything beyond Tuesday, but I asked him to hold tight. He nodded but didn't look convinced. By noon, Brenda had called the co-op and demanded that the standing apple contract be canceled. Margot Hale, the co-op manager, called me 20 minutes later. "Cecilia, what in the world is happening over there?" I explained it as simply as I could. My sister believed she owned the farm. The will hadn't been read. Margot was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your mama would roll over in her grave. She told me not to worry about the contract. I'll make some calls, she said. There are people in this county who remember what your parents built. Sunday, Derek was on the phone all afternoon. I could hear him from the barn. He had a loud voice and no awareness of it. He was calling real estate agents, quoting acreage and road frontage numbers he'd pulled from the county website. He told one agent, "We're looking at a potential $22 million sale. The owner wants to move fast." The owner. Brenda didn't own a single fence post on that property, but she'd spent 48 hours acting like she owned every blade of grass, and nobody had stopped her. Yet. Pastor Greer came to the barn apartment on Sunday afternoon. He knocked twice, took off his hat, and stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. He looked around at the cot, the workbench desk, the single window. "This is no place for you, Cecilia," he said. I told him it was temporary. He sat on the only chair and clasped his hands like he was about to pray. But he didn't pray. He talked. "Your parents were pillars of this community," he said. "They would want peace in this family above all else." I said I wanted peace too. He leaned forward. "Brenda is the eldest. She has a legitimate claim. Maybe it's time to let her take the lead. For the family's sake." I looked at him. Harold Greer had baptized me when I was 11. He'd presided over my parents' 30th anniversary celebration. He'd sat at our kitchen table 100 times, eating Mom's cornbread and talking about the church roof fund. And now he was telling me to hand over everything my parents built. I asked him if he thought my parents would want the farm sold. He shifted in his seat. Maybe that's God's plan for a new chapter. Then he said it. "Brenda mentioned continuing your parents' generous tradition with the church. She talked about a significant donation once the estate is settled. I think that's a beautiful tribute." There it was. The price tag on his loyalty. Brenda had promised money to the church, and Pastor Greer had come to collect, wearing concern like a costume. I told him the will reading was on Tuesday and everything would be settled then. He stood up, put his hat back on, and said, "I hope you'll do the right thing, Cecilia." The right thing. According to whom? Monday morning, I drove to the Farmers Market Co-op to drop off the weekly production report. I'd been doing this every Monday for 10 years. Same clipboard, same route, same wave to the loading dock crew. But this Monday, people looked at me differently. Not hostile, curious, careful. The way you look at someone when you've heard something about them but haven't decided what to believe yet. At the register, a woman named Patty, who sold jams out of booth 6, said, "I heard your sister's having a tough time getting what's rightfully hers." I asked where she'd heard that. "Around," she said. Margot pulled me into her office. "Brenda's been talking to everyone," she said. "She's telling people you're trying to cut her out of the inheritance, that you manipulated your parents, that you isolated them on the farm so nobody else could get close." Isolated them. My parents who drove to Ruth Ann's house for Sunday dinner every week. My parents who volunteered at the county fair every September. My parents who knew every cashier at the grocery store by name. Derek had been busy too. Margot told me someone had shown her a Facebook post from his account, something about a family farm dispute, and one sibling hoarding everything while the other just wants what's fair. I didn't respond. Not publicly. I went back to the truck, drove to the barn, and did what I always did. Fed the cattle, checked the fences, updated the ledger. I didn't do it to prove a point. I did it because it was my job, and those animals didn't care about Facebook posts. On my way out of the co-op, a man I barely knew stopped me in the parking lot. "I heard your sister already signed papers with a developer," he said, "some company out of Charlottesville." That afternoon, I checked the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It was still in my parents' name. I hadn't changed it, and neither had Brenda. Most of it was sympathy cards and junk mail. But tucked between a phone bill and a flyer for gutter cleaning was an envelope from Blue Ridge Development, LLC, Charlottesville, Virginia. I opened it on the tailgate of my truck. It was a letter of intent, a formal offer to purchase 250 acres of agricultural land, the Everett Farm, for $22 million. The letter was addressed to Brenda Everett Marsh, owner, signed by Brenda on the bottom. I read it twice. She had signed a letter of intent to sell property she didn't own. The will hadn't been read. Probate hadn't started. She had zero legal authority over that land. I called Tom Beckett from the truck, told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment. She can sign every letter she wants, he said. Until probate is complete and the will is executed, she has no legal authority to transfer, sell, or encumber any property in the estate. His voice was calm, but the words were sharp. Keep that document, he said. And, Cecilia, Tuesday. Everything will be clear on Tuesday. That was the second time he'd said it like that. Tuesday, with a weight behind it. Like the word itself was a promise. I sat in the truck for a long time after we hung up. Brenda had been here less than a week, and she'd already tried to sell the farm out from under me. She hadn't read the will. She hadn't asked what our parents wanted. She'd just assumed, because she was older, because she'd come back, because she'd decided this was hers. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Monday night. I was reviewing the quarterly tax estimates when the barn door scraped open. Derek walked in without knocking. He had that car salesman lean, shoulder against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, smile that didn't reach his eyes. Hey, Cecilia. Got a minute? I told him I was working. He ignored it, stepped inside, looked around the barn apartment like he was pricing the fixtures. Look, he said, Brenda and I have been talking. We want to make this easy for everyone. He pulled a piece of paper from his jacket. $50,000, clean break. You sign over any claim to the estate, and we hand you a check tomorrow. I told him the farm was worth 30 times that. He shrugged. The farm isn't yours. Never was. You were the bookkeeper. The bookkeeper. The hired help. They all had the same language. He kept going. Be realistic. You're living in a barn. You have no claim, no leverage, and no money to hire a lawyer who can compete with ours. I set down my pen, looked at him. Then I guess we'll let the will decide. His smile dropped. The salesman mask came off. Underneath was something smaller and meaner. He stepped closer. You really want to make this difficult? Brenda and I have connections in Richmond, lawyers who actually win cases. You drag this out, you'll lose everything, including that little barn. I didn't change my tone. Tuesday, Derek. We'll all hear what my parents wanted. He stared at me for a long beat. Then he turned and walked out, pulling the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. I sat there in the quiet afterward, thinking. Derek wasn't just greedy, he was nervous. Something about Tuesday scared him. I wondered what he already knew that he wasn't telling Brenda. I couldn't sleep. Midnight, and I was reorganizing the barn apartment for the third time, a habit from childhood, rearranging things when my mind wouldn't settle. I pulled the cot away from the wall to sweep under it, and my hand hit a box. Cardboard. Dusty. The kind Mom used for storing canning labels and seed catalogs. It must have been there since the last time she set up the barn for a seasonal worker. I almost pushed it aside, but the top had Mom's handwriting on it. The slanted left-hand script, the way it always tilted when she was tired. She'd written barn supplies on the lid, but inside there were no supplies. Just an envelope, cream-colored. My name on the front. Cecilia. When you need this. Not sealed with glue but tucked closed, like she'd wanted me to open it easily. I sat on the floor and read it. Cecilia, if you're reading this, things probably went the way your father and I feared. Brenda will try to take everything. Don't fight her with words. She'll always outtalk you. Let the papers do the talking. Tom has everything. Trust him. And trust what you've built here. Love, Mom. I read it 4 times. My mother's handwriting. The ink pressed hard in some places, lighter in others. She'd written this slowly, choosing her words the way she chose everything, with care. She'd probably sat at the kitchen table after Dad went to bed, the lamp making a circle of yellow on the wood, and she'd written this letter knowing exactly what would happen when she was gone. She knew Brenda. She loved her anyway. But she protected me. I folded the letter, slipped it into my shirt pocket, and sat there until the sun came up. Tuesday morning. I was up at 5, fed the cattle, topped off the water troughs, checked the cold storage compressor. The same routine I'd done every morning for 10 years. There was comfort in it. The predictability. The fact that the animals didn't care about wills or sisters or lawyers. They just wanted hay and clean water, and I could give them that. I showered in the barn apartment's rust-stained shower and put on my work clothes. Clean button-down, dark slacks, flat shoes. Not dressed up, just professional. The way I looked when I met with the bank or the co-op board. I was an accountant going to a meeting, and I dressed like one. Through the window, I watched Brenda and Derek loading bags into the rental car. Brenda wore a black fitted dress and sunglasses, like she was headed to a press conference. Derek had on a sport coat that was tight in the shoulders and a tie I was sure he'd borrowed. They looked like they'd already won. My phone buzzed. Ruth Ann. "You ready, hun?" I told her I was as ready as I'd ever be. Ruth Ann paused. Then she said, "Your mama and I used to say, the truth doesn't need a loud voice, just a patient one." I grabbed my binder of farm records, the USB drive, and the letter from Mom. Locked the barn apartment, walked past the main house where the rental car was idling in the driveway. Brenda saw me through the window. She didn't wave. I got in my truck. The same Ford F-150 I'd driven for 8 years, with mud on the fenders and a co-op parking sticker on the bumper, and pulled out onto the county road. Tom Beckett's office was 20 minutes away. 20 minutes to whatever came next. Tom Beckett's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, above the hardware store. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled like old carpet and coffee. I'd been there a dozen times, for farm contracts, for tax filings, for the time Dad needed a liability waiver for the county fair booth. Today, the conference room door was open. Tom stood at the head of a long table with a leather briefcase and a glass of water. He nodded when I walked in. "Morning, Cecilia." Ruth Ann was already seated, hands folded on the table. Margot Hale sat next to her, reading something on her phone. They both looked up when I entered. Ruth Ann gave me a small nod, steady, reassuring, the same nod she'd given me at the funeral. Brenda and Derek arrived 7 minutes later. Brenda stopped in the doorway when she saw the room. "Why are they here?" She was looking at Ruth Ann and Margot. Tom answered. "They're named in the will." Brenda's jaw tightened. She looked at Derek. He shrugged. A "don't worry about it" shrug, and pulled out a chair. Pastor Greer arrived last. He slid into a seat near the door, hat in his lap, not making eye contact with anyone. Brenda sat at the center of the table, crossed her legs, put her hands flat on the surface, confident, in charge, like she was running the meeting. Tom opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Thick. Not the 2 or 3 pages Brenda probably expected. A real stack, tabbed and bound. Brenda glanced at it. Her left eye twitched. Tom said, "Before we begin, I want to clarify that this will has 2 parts. We'll read part 1 first." 2 parts. The room shifted. 2 parts. The will had 2 parts. And my sister didn't know about the second one. She'd spent the past week changing locks, calling realtors, and telling everyone in town that I was the selfish one. She sat in that chair like she'd already won. If someone has ever underestimated you because you stayed quiet, keep watching. And leave a comment. I want to hear your story too. Tom adjusted his glasses and began reading. Last Will and Testament of Frank Harrison Everett and Linda May Everett. Part 1. Direct Bequests. He read slowly, clearly, like he'd practiced it. To our daughter Brenda Everett Marsh, we leave the family home at 1847 Orchard Lane, including all furnishings and personal property therein, and the sum of $280,000 from the joint savings account at Valley National Bank. Brenda exhaled. She turned to me with a look that said, "See? I was right." Derek squeezed her hand under the table. Pastor Greer nodded from his corner like the universe had confirmed something. Tom continued, This bequest is subject to the following condition. Brenda Everett Marsh must reside at the property and maintain it in good condition for a period of no less than 5 years from the date of this will's execution. Failure to meet this condition will result in the property reverting to the Everett family trust. Brenda's smile cracked at the edges. 5 years? She said. I'm not living here for 5 years. Derek leaned over. We'll figure that out later. What else? Tom looked at them both. That concludes part 1. Brenda blinked. That's it? $280,000? The farm alone is worth millions. Tom folded his hands. The house and the bank account are what's designated in part 1, yes. The number hung in the air. 280,000. Brenda had spent the past week telling people she was inheriting $28 million. She'd signed a letter of intent to sell land for $22 million. And part 1 of the will gave her a house she'd have to live in, and less than $300,000 she'd probably already spent in her head. She gripped the edge of the table. Where's the rest? Derek was on his feet. Where's the land? The equipment? The mineral rights? There's over $20 million in assets here. Where is it? Tom didn't flinch. That's covered in part 2. Derek and Brenda looked at each other. Something passed between them. Not partnership, but calculation. Two people doing the same math and not liking the numbers. Brenda turned on me. You knew about this, didn't you? You set this up with the lawyer. You manipulated them. I kept my voice flat. I'm hearing this for the first time, just like you. It was the truth. I had Mom's letter in my pocket. I knew my parents had planned something, but I didn't know the details. I didn't know about part 2 until this moment, sitting in the same room as everyone else. Pastor Greer cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all stay calm. I'm sure Frank and Linda meant well for both their daughters. He said it to the room, but he was looking at Brenda, reassuring the wrong person. Tom reached into his briefcase again. He pulled out a second envelope. It was different from the first, heavier, sealed with a notary stamp, the paper a slightly different shade. He held it up for the room to see. Part 2, he said. This document was filed separately 7 years ago. It is a legally distinct instrument from the will we just read. He broke the seal. The sound was small, paper tearing, but in that room, it sounded like a door opening. Brenda stared at the envelope. Derek sat back down, slowly. Pastor Greer leaned forward. Ruth Ann's hands were still folded. Margot caught my eye across the table and held it for half a second. I took a breath. Tom began to read. Frank and Linda Everett established the Everett Family Irrevocable Trust on March 15, 2019. Tom's voice was steady, professional, the voice of a man who had been waiting 7 years to read this document. The trust encompasses the following assets: 250 acres of agricultural land, registered as the Everett Farm, including all structures, equipment, and improvements therein. Mineral extraction rights for the property, as recorded with the Virginia Department of Energy. The Everett Educational Fund, currently valued at approximately $2.1 million. Equity shares in the Blue Ridge Agricultural Cooperative. Tom looked up from the document. The total estimated value of the trust assets, as of last quarterly assessment, is approximately $27.5 million. The number landed like a stone in water. $27.5 million. Not in the will. In a trust. Established 7 years ago, while both my parents were alive, healthy, and clear-minded. Brenda's face went white. Not red. White. The blood left it all at once. 27 million? She whispered. Tom nodded. Your parents planned this carefully, Brenda. The trust was established, funded, and executed 7 years before their passing. Derek was gripping the armrests of his chair. His knuckles had gone the same color as Brenda's face. I sat still. My hands were in my lap. Mom's letter was in my pocket, the paper warm against my chest. Let the papers do the talking. The trust designates a single trustee, Tom continued. The trustee is responsible for managing all trust assets, maintaining the farm operations, and administering the educational fund. Brenda straightened up. "That's me," she said. "I'm the eldest. The trustee is obviously me." Tom looked at her over his glasses. "Let me finish reading." Tom read the trustee conditions one line at a time, and each line was a nail in a coffin Brenda didn't know she was building. The trustee must be a person who has A. resided on the Everett farm property continuously for at least 5 years prior to the grantor's death. He paused. Let it settle. B. Maintained verifiable financial records of farm operations. Another pause. And C. Demonstrated active participation in the local agricultural community, as verified by the Blue Ridge Agricultural Cooperative. The room was silent. Not the polite silence of a meeting, the loaded silence of people doing math they didn't want to finish. Brenda hadn't lived on the farm in 20 years. She had no financial records. She had no relationship with the co-op. She met 0 of the 3 conditions. "That's ridiculous," Brenda said. "Who wrote these conditions?" "Your parents," Tom said. "With my counsel. 7 years ago." Derek stood up again. His chair scraped the floor. "This is clearly biased. The conditions were written specifically to exclude Brenda. We'll contest this." Tom's voice didn't change. "An irrevocable trust cannot be easily contested, Mr. Marsh. It was established while both grantors were of sound mind, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized by the Commonwealth of Virginia." He looked at Ruth Ann, then at Margot. "The 2 witnesses are present in this room." Ruth Ann met Brenda's eyes for the first time. Margot sat up straighter. They hadn't just been named in the will, they were the witnesses. They had stood in this office 7 years ago and watched my parents sign away $27.5 million to a trust built to protect the farm, the community, and the daughter who had earned it. Brenda's chair hit the wall behind her. She was on her feet, hands flat on the table, leaning forward like she could intimidate the documents into changing. "This is a setup. Cecilia manipulated them. She kept them isolated on this farm and poisoned them against me." I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Ruth Ann's voice came from across the table, quiet as church. "Linda and Frank drove themselves to my house every Sunday for dinner for 20 years, Brenda. Nobody isolated them." Margot spoke next. "And Cecilia's been running this farm's books for a decade. I've seen the records. Every penny accounted for. Every contract honored. Every tax filing on time." Brenda pointed at me. "She told them what to do. She controlled them." Ruth Ann shook her head. "Your parents controlled themselves just fine, hun. They made this decision with clear eyes. I sat right there in that chair when they signed the trust. Your mother cried. Not because she was confused, because she knew what Brenda would do, and she loved her anyway." That landed. Even Brenda felt it. Her finger dropped. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Derek grabbed her elbow. "We need to talk. Outside. Now." Brenda shook him off. "No. I want to hear all of it." Pastor Greer had been shrinking in his chair throughout the reading. His face was the color of old paper. He'd bet on the wrong horse. He'd traded his pastoral duty for a promise from a woman who didn't own what she was promising. Tom waited for the room to settle. Then he said, "There's one more section, the trustee designation." He turned the page. Tom read it plainly. No drama, no build-up, just the words on the page. "The designated trustee of the Everett Family Irrevocable Trust is Cecilia Marie Everett." Silence. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of inevitability. Everyone in that room except Brenda and Derek had already done the math. The conditions described one person. The trust named that person. "No," Brenda said. Her voice was small now. The boardroom confidence gone. "No, no, no, that can't be right." "It's right, Brenda," Tom said. "Your parents specifically named Cecilia." My face was hot. Not from pride, not from victory, from something deeper. The realization that my parents had seen me. For 10 years I'd wondered if they noticed. If staying behind while Brenda chased the world made me invisible or essential. Now I knew. They'd built a $27.5 million trust around me, not because I was the favorite, but because I was the one who showed up. Tom continued reading. The trust required the trustee to maintain farm operations, contribute to the local agricultural community, and administer the Everett Educational Fund, scholarships for rural students. It wasn't a gift. It was a job description. My parents hadn't left me money. They'd left me a mandate. One additional clause, Tom said. In the event that the designated trustee fails to meet the operational and community requirements, the trust assets revert to a community foundation, the Blue Ridge Rural Development Fund. Under no circumstances do the trust assets transfer to any individual beneficiary other than the designated trustee. Derek's head snapped up. That clause meant one thing. Even if Cecilia failed, the money would never go to Brenda. Ever. My parents had closed every door. Brenda was shaking. Not from cold. From the kind of rage that has nowhere to go. She turned to Pastor Greer, who was studying his own hands like they belonged to someone else. "Do something," she said. "You said you'd support me. You told me the church would back my claim." Every head turned to Greer. The room got very small. Tom said, "Pastor Greer, were you aware of the trust's terms before today?" Greer didn't look up. No, Brenda asked me to speak on her behalf, as a community leader." Ruth Ann leaned forward. "Harold, Linda and Frank gave that church $15,000 a year for 20 years. They put a new roof over your head twice, and you took Brenda's side for a promise she couldn't keep?" Greer's hands were trembling. He looked at Ruth Ann, then at me, and his eyes were wet. Not with shame, with something worse. Fear. I just didn't want to lose the church," he said. His voice cracked. "Your parents built that congregation. Half the pews have plaques with their names on them. Without their support, I didn't know if we could keep the doors open." For 1 second I saw him. Not the man who'd betrayed me. The man who'd been terrified of watching something he loved disappear. It was a human moment, but it didn't change what he'd done. Margot spoke. "The church won't lose anything, Harold. The trust includes a community fund. It covers annual support for local institutions. If you'd asked instead of assuming the worst, you'd have known that." Greer put his face in his hands. The room watched him fold. Nobody helped him up. Derek had been calculating this whole time. I could see it. The way his eyes moved, the way his jaw worked. He was running numbers, and the numbers were bad. He broke first. "This is insane," he said. His voice was loud in the quiet room. "We had a buyer lined up. Blue Ridge Development was going to pay $22 million for this land. There were plans, subdivision plans. This was going to be 300 residential lots." Silence. Every person in that room looked at Derek Marsh. The ex-husband, the car salesman, the man who'd walked onto a family's land the day after their funeral and started measuring it for profit. Brenda turned on him. "Derek, shut up." But it was too late. Tom's voice was precise as a scalpel. "Mr. Marsh, you just admitted to negotiating the sale of property you have no legal claim to. Depending on the representations made to Blue Ridge Development, that may constitute fraud." Derek's face went red. "I'm not— Brenda signed those papers, not me." Brenda slammed the table. "You told me to sign them. You said it was standard. You said any eldest child inherits everything automatically." They were turning on each other. Right there, in front of everyone. The partnership that had seemed so solid a week ago, the matching confidence, the shared plan, the coordinated pressure on me, shattered like cheap glass. I sat in my chair and watched. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My parents had written the script. Tom, Ruth Ann, Margot. They were the cast. And Brenda and Derek were performing their own unraveling better than anyone could have directed. They were turning on each other right there in the lawyer's office, blaming each other for a plan that was falling apart. My sister's ex-husband had tried to sell land that wasn't even hers, and Pastor Greer sat there with his head in his hands. But the lawyer wasn't done yet. There was one more thing. Stay with me, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Brenda was standing in the middle of the room. Her mascara had smudged. Her hands were fists at her sides. She looked nothing like the woman who'd walked in an hour ago. The designer dress, the sunglasses, the crossed legs. She looked cornered. "I'm contesting this," she said. "All of it. Every page. I'll get my own lawyer. A real one. Not some small-town paper pusher." Tom didn't react to the insult. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Brenda the way a doctor looks at a patient who refuses treatment. Not angry, just patient. "Are you sure you understand the will?" The question stopped everything, not because it was loud, because it was exact. One short sentence, delivered without heat, without judgment, without a trace of superiority. Just a question. The kind of question that only means something when the answer is no. Brenda stared at him. "What's there to understand? You rigged this for her. You and those two." She waved at Ruth Ann and Margot. Tom shook his head. "I didn't write the conditions, Brenda. Your parents did, and there's a reason they did it this way." He reached to the last page of the trust document. "There's an addendum, a personal letter from Frank and Linda Everett, to be read aloud at the will reading." He looked at me, at Brenda, at everyone. "Your parents asked me to read this to both of you, together." The room went still. Not the stillness of tension, the stillness of something sacred. A message from two people who were no longer alive, delivered in the only voice they had left. Tom began to read. "To our daughters, we loved you both equally. Brenda, we gave you freedom, the money for your apartment, your car, your fresh starts. 3 times. We never asked for it back. Cecilia, we gave you roots, the land, the work, the community. We watched you choose this life every single day, and we wanted to make sure it would always be here for you." Tom kept reading. His voice was steady, but I could see his hand tremble at the edge of the page. He'd known my parents for 30 years. This wasn't just a legal document to him. "Brenda, we structured the house and the account for you because we know you need a home. The 5-year condition is not a punishment, it's an invitation. Come home. Learn what we built. Work the land that your grandfather cleared with his bare hands. If you stay, you'll understand why Cecilia never left." Tom paused, took a breath. "If you choose not to stay, the house returns to the trust, and the community fund will use it for the town's children. We would rather give this house to strangers who will love it than watch it be sold by a daughter who doesn't." Ruth Ann was crying, not sobbing. Tears running down her cheeks, hands still folded, not wiping them away. Margot's jaw was set tight, her eyes red. Even Derek had gone quiet. There was no angle to play here, no deal to cut. Just 2 dead parents telling the truth. Tom continued. "Cecilia, the trust is not a reward. It's a responsibility. We know you'll carry it because you always have. Since you were 23 years old, you've kept this farm alive, kept the books, kept the contracts, kept the land productive and the community fed. You never asked for credit. You never asked for more. We couldn't say this while we were alive without hurting Brenda. But we can say it now. You are the one we trust." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let my parents' words fill the room. They were saying what they'd never said out loud. Not because they didn't feel it, but because saying it would have meant admitting that one daughter had failed and the other hadn't. They'd carried that silence their whole lives, and they'd broken it from beyond the grave, in the only way that couldn't be argued with. On paper. Witnessed. Notarized. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Then Brenda exploded. "This is a joke!" Her voice hit the walls and bounced back. "You're telling me I get a house and 200,000 while she gets 27 million? I'm their daughter. I'm the firstborn." She swept her arm across the table. Papers scattered. Brenda's purse hit the floor. Her phone skidded across the wood. Derek grabbed her arm. "Brenda, we need to go, now." She shook him off. "Get off me. This is your fault. You told me to sign those papers. You told me it was a sure thing." She rounded on me, her finger an inch from my face. You poisoned them against me. You stole my parents. You sat here in this dirt and you brainwashed them into giving you everything. I stood up. Slowly. I looked at my sister. Her smudged mascara, her shaking hands, her designer dress twisted where Derek had grabbed her arm. She was the eldest. She was the one who'd left. She was the one who'd called herself the rightful heir, and she was falling apart in front of everyone. I said one thing. The hired help kept the books, and the books don't lie. Brenda's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her own words, from that morning after the funeral, handed back to her. The hired help. That's what she'd called me. And now the hired help was standing in a room where the paperwork said otherwise. Tom spoke into the silence. Brenda, for the purposes of this reading, the will and trust are concluded. If you wish to contest, you'll need to file with the probate court. I should mention that the legal fees for contesting an irrevocable trust typically start around $50,000, and the success rate is approximately 4%. Brenda grabbed her purse off the floor. Derek took her elbow. This time she didn't shake him off. She let him steer her toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, looked back at me, and said, "This isn't over." The door closed behind them. The door clicked shut. The room exhaled. Pastor Greer stood up. He didn't look at anyone. He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands once, and then he looked at me. "I owe you an apology, Cecilia," he said. "I was wrong. I was selfish, and I was wrong." I looked at this man who had baptized me, who had stood at my parents' graveside, who had come to my barn to convince me to surrender. "You were scared, Pastor," I said. "There's a difference." He nodded. His eyes were red. He put on his hat and walked out without another word. The room was smaller now. Just me, Tom, Ruth Ann, and Margot. Ruth Ann stood up and walked around the table. She wrapped her arms around me, thin arms, stronger than they looked, and held on. "Your mama would be so proud of you," she whispered. I said, "She planned this whole thing." Ruth Ann pulled back and looked at me. "She planned it because she knew you, sweetheart. She knew you'd be sitting right here. She knew you'd keep those books. She knew you'd stay." Margot was next. She didn't hug me. She shook my hand. Firm, professional, the way we always did business. "The co-op contracts are safe?" I nodded. "They were never in danger. The trust protects them." Margot's eyes were red, but her handshake was steady. "Good. Your parents built something that matters." Tom Beckett stood by the window, letting me have the moment. When I turned to him, he extended his hand. "Your parents were two of the smartest people I've known in 30 years of practice," he said. "And they were right about you." I walked out of that office into the November air. The sky over the Blue Ridge was the color of steel wool, cold and clear. I drove back the way I'd come. 20 minutes on the county road, past the co-op, past the church, past the elementary school where Mom used to volunteer. The truck smelled like hay and diesel, and the leather seat Dad never got around to patching. I pulled into the driveway. The rental car was gone. Brenda and Derek had already left. I walked to the main house. The lock was still the one Brenda had installed. Brass, shiny, out of place on a door that was 50 years old. I didn't try it. I didn't need to go in today. I walked back across the yard to the barn apartment, sat on the cot, took the letter out of my pocket and unfolded it on the workbench. Mom's handwriting. "Trust what you've built here." I looked out the window. 250 acres of Everett land, the orchard rows running straight toward the mountains, the way Dad had planted them, north to south, for maximum sun. The cattle pasture where the creek bent, the cold storage building with the co-op logo on the side. The November light was low and gold. My parents hadn't left me money. They'd left me responsibility. The kind you can't deposit in a bank account, or sign over to a developer, or spend in a city you never come back from. They'd left me the land, the work, the community. And I'd been ready for it my whole life. 3 months later, the dust had settled into new patterns. Brenda didn't stay. She lasted 2 weeks in the house, 2 weeks of silence from me, 2 weeks of nobody in town returning her calls, 2 weeks of the reality that inheriting a farmhouse meant paying for heating oil and septic maintenance, and a roof that leaked over the back bedroom. She packed her bags and drove back to Richmond without saying goodbye. Under the terms of the will, she had 5 years to fulfill the residency requirement. Her clock was ticking. By February, the house was empty. By March, I filed the paperwork to begin the reversion process. Tom said it would take time. Probate isn't fast. But the outcome was certain. Brenda wouldn't be back. Derek had bigger problems. Tom forwarded the Blue Ridge Development letter of intent to the county prosecutor's office. Negotiating the sale of property without legal authority, using misrepresentation to induce a commercial transaction. The charges were still being evaluated, but Derek had hired a lawyer. A real one this time. Brenda cut all contact with him. Pastor Greer stepped down from the church board in January. The congregation elected a new head pastor, a younger woman from Staunton who didn't know the Everett family history and didn't owe anyone anything. Greer still attended Sunday services. He sat in the back pew. He didn't make eye contact with me. The Everett Educational Fund issued its first 3 scholarships in February, $15,000 each, for rural students pursuing agriculture or community development degrees. I signed the checks at Mom's kitchen table. I'd moved back into the house the week Brenda left. Changed the lock. One last time. This time with my own key. Brenda called once. It was a Thursday evening in March. I was sitting on the porch, watching the last of the winter light drain off the mountains. I almost didn't answer. But I did. She didn't say hello, she said. Is there any way I can get more from the trust? I told her the trust was for the farm and the community, not for either of us to spend. So you're just going to sit on $27 million? She said. I'm going to manage it, I said. The way Mom and Dad asked me to. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear traffic in the background. She was driving somewhere. She was always driving somewhere. Cecilia, she said. And for a second her voice sounded different. Younger. Like the sister who used to braid my hair when I was 7, before she decided this life wasn't enough for her. But the moment passed. This isn't fair, she said. I said. The door's open if you want to come home, Brenda. For real this time. Not for the money. For the farm. Mom and Dad gave you 5 years. Silence. Then she hung up. I set the phone down on the porch railing. The cattle were moving toward the barn for the night. Slow shapes in the fading light. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was something else. Settled. The way the land feels after a long rain. Not dry, not flooded. Just holding exactly the right amount of water. I stood on the porch that evening and looked out at the farm, the orchard, the pasture, the mountains beyond. My parents didn't leave me money. They left me proof that staying, showing up, doing the quiet work nobody notices, that's not being the hired help. That's being the one they trusted most. That's my story. A changed lock, a second envelope, a mother's letter tucked under a barn bed. If you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else left, your time is coming. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below, and subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge for more stories like this one.